How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? Yes, and how many seas?
The Vietnam War sparked an anti-war movement that was unprecedented in terms of its size and the tactics it employed. Opposition to the war was so intense that historians such as George McGovern have insisted that the war was not lost in Vietnam, but in the anti-war movement in America. Through the analysis of 3 primary sources and secondary reading, this project aims not to challenge McGovern's debate, but to focus instead on the extent to which the counterculture fueled the anti-war movement. By extent, we are measuring the degree to which it featured in the movement and its contribution in helping to end the war. This is a layered historiographical debate due to the decentralized nature of the movement's subgroups, the skewed media perspectives, and the evolution of the counterculture's role as the war continued. The first source I shall examine is a provocative anti-war poster entitled "Uncle Sam Needs You, Nigger." It aims to critique both the war and the current composition of society by demonstrating a series of contradictions existing in society's treatment of blacks and the cause black GIs would be fighting for. Without even examining the poster's text, we infer a countercultural theme by engaging with its visual elements. Our eyes are immediately drawn to the figure in the top left corner, Uncle Sam. In essence, this character embodies the quintessential American and acts as a metaphor for the values America represents. There are clearly stark differences though between a typical sketch of Uncle Sam seen to the left of your picture and that the poster uses. Perhaps the most noticeable alteration is in his colouring, which has been bleached to an orange tint. Stripping Uncle Sam of the familiar red, white and blue of the American flag is no printing error, however. It deliberately attempts to convey a feeling of disenchantment with the social iniquities America currently peddles. This is reaffirmed by the sardonic tone the document assumes when it calls for black men to fight for freedom, followed by the condition that this does not relieve them of their own oppression, only that purportedly experienced by the Vietnamese. By implication, this source follows a countercultural narrative as it calls for a remedy to America's ills, and corroborates Ryan Kirkby's view that the anti-war movement embraced a kind of cultural revolt aimed at replacing discredited American values and norms. Indeed, historians such as Sam Brown would be keen to take this argument a stage further, saying that the civil rights movement, and by extension the counterculture's development, was a necessary prior condition for anti-war activism. Analysing the poster's interaction with the language and the themes of the civil rights movement offers this view some credence. This is particularly in its emphasis of the inferior status of blacks in the eyes of society and government, whether it be expressed more subtly by calling them a mercenary army, rendering them foreign soldiers rather than members of the American military, or the downright cruder "die, nigger, die." Yet the historiographical debate is more complex than a simple connection between the anti-war movement and counterculture. To understand this, we'll consider the group who produced the poster, the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, or VSC. Unlike many other groups opposed to the war, the VSC were founded in Britain. It would therefore be natural to assume that this source imparts an international perspective to our question. Great! But then again, you know what assumptions did. The role of decentralization is critical in our assessment here. Specifically citing the Vietnam Day Committee, or VDC, Gerard de Groot identifies that anti-war groups were never bound by a single ideology, which means that the poster may bear little representation of opinions throughout the movement. What's more, de Groot later insists that the VDC was sapped of its support because it had little sympathy for the fact US GIs, like Vietnam peasants, were victims of the war, thereby causing more damage to the peace movement than it caused Johnson's war. Given this occurred in 1966, the same year as the poster's distribution, it appears unlikely that some of the abrasive wording, in particular the reference to killing off of other oppressed people, would have been accepted across the VSC. In turn, this questions our ability to draw conclusions from the source. for it would be dangerous to see it as resembling the wider movement's perspective. Effectively then, it is only illustrating the divergent views within anti-war organisations as to how their argument should be presented. The issue of representing the anti-war movement is a suitable bridge to cross over to our second document, Terry Southern's article Grooving in the Chai, which reported on the Democratic Party's 1968 Chicago Convention and the ensuing clashes between anti-war protesters and the police. Throughout the text, it becomes clear that there is an agenda from the media to create what Charles Chatfield has described as a convenient counterculture stereotype with which to castigate anti-war opposition. Within the opening paragraph, Southern supplies us an insight as to the beliefs held by the American population regarding the counterculture. Bill Burroughs, a member of Southern's writing team, is instructed to discern any sign of the use of drugs, while Southern is on double alert for all manner of absurdity. Put more plainly, these journalists were tasked with sniffing out and flagging any semblance of counterculture in order to alienate the American population. From this we learn that amongst a sizable number of Americans there was considerable discomfort with what the counterculture stood for. Some of the secondary literature attests to the anti-war movement's awareness of this and its potential to estrange millions of uncommitted Americans who opposed the war but did not relate to radical and irresponsible protests. Meanwhile, Southern quotes David Dellinger's assured commitment to ensure demonstrations would be entirely peaceful. In spite of this effort, the commands issued to the journalists, accompanied by the apparent glee Burroughs derives from being a profoundly disruptive factor in the overall convention profile, supports Chatfield's stereotype. On the third page lay a caricature that symbolises Southern's frustration with this form of journalism. The figure depicts nobody referenced in the article. It actually serves as a criticism of the current state of anti-war journalism. Not only does the man fail to focus on the surface he is writing on, but he also wears a vacuous look across his face, emitting the impression that he is operating on autopilot, giving no thought whatsoever to what he is writing down. A closer look at the balloons surrounding him reinforces this point, for the two which bear writing have the exact same opening to their message. Unfortunately, this implies a trade no longer reporting the facts as they see it, and that a fixed, standardized template has been constructed for coverage on the anti-war movement. It was an attempt to depict it as inextricable from counterculture, which, as the first source stresses, was not necessarily the case. Furthermore, Southern exposes the enthusiasm the police held for inflicting violence upon protesters. Arguably though, the police's use of confrontation provocateurs to legitimize their attacks is not the most revealing element with respect to the counterculture's role in anti-war movements. Underpinning this view is the lack of police attention allocated to Southern and his cohort once they are infiltrated in an apartment block, because, as Southern says, it wasn't really us they wanted to get. It was the children they wanted. Theodore Roszak highlights the reasoning for targeting the youth. According to Roszak, the young remake the lethal culture of their elders, and therefore they were the staple of the counterculture. Central to the counterculture were the ideas of promoting racial and gender equality, yet for the police this was not desirable. Tove Pedersen explains that the constructions of masculinity and ethnicity became central for how police controls were both exercised and perceived. Hence, there was an eagerness to associate the counterculture with public disorder, as what it stood for threatened the functioning of the police force. This is why they aimed to exaggerate the role of the counterculture in the anti-war movement. Thus, this source has shown some institutional attitudes concerning the anti-war groups, and the caution that the historian must thereby exercise in evaluating the influence of the counterculture upon the movement. Appreciating the counterculture's importance to the anti-war movement in 1968 allows comparisons to be made with its status in 1971, the date of our final piece of primary material. Here, John Kerry, head of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, delivered a speech to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee mirroring the themes of the VSC's poster. Of particular note is Kerry's call
to conquer the hate and fear that have driven this country these last 10 years and more.
As the head of the movement, Kerry acts as a medium for the views of his members, and also attempts to reflect the attitudes of the wider public. Consequently, we gauge that there has been a marked shift in public opinion. Now we see an anti-war organisation overtly subscribing to the Counterculture's message, which after absorbing the findings of the first two sources would seem counterintuitive. However, in the years that elapsed between sources 2 and 3, revelations including the My Lai massacre began to surface, and the public became more receptive to the Counterculture's narrative. Accordingly, Kerry looks to harness these new conditions. In order to do so, he has to reconstruct his language because, as George Lakoff has suggested, new language is required for new frames. In other words, Kerry adapted anti-war rhetoric to utilise the changing mindset or frame of the American public, and this meant affording greater prominence to the counterculture in his address. To an extent, this is underlined by Kerry's assertion that war generals had
left all the casualties and retreated behind a pious shield of public rectitude.
Taken in isolation, these words could be misinterpreted as backing of the intentions of the government and military. A Gallup poll intimates otherwise, however, with 73% of Americans wanting a withdrawal from Vietnam by the end of 1971. In fact, as we learned from Southern, the shield Kerry refers to is that of the media, preventing positive portrayals of the anti-war movement and forwarding a pro-war stance. Nonetheless, Kerry's combination of the military terminology shield and retreat in a context where the American majority is now thoroughly opposed to the war implies that people were wise to the media's prejudices, prompting the shield's dissolution. Indeed, this view is bolstered by Dellinger's conversion to more radical tactics, as he hoped to paralyse the war machine through May Day civil disobedience. Previously, such an occurrence would have been the media's dream, with the 7,200 arrests conducted on the day providing a real opportunity for the anti-war movement to be condemned. In spite of this, George Hopkins has concluded that public opinion had already shifted decidedly against the war, and the illegal excesses of May Day would not change that. To conclude the analysis of this source, it is necessary to turn to folk music, which Peter Goldsmith has described as a valorization of the people's struggle for self-definition in the face of dehumanizing modernist incursions. Therefore, the popularity of the likes of Bob Dylan in the early 60s indicates that there were latent tensions regarding American society prior to the war's escalation in 1965. This source then articulates how these tensions exacerbated during the course of the war, leading the counterculture to become more crucial to the movement as the war progressed and was eventually brought to an end. Overall, whilst the analysis should be treated as a continuous process, for the extent to which the counterculture featured in the anti-war movement fluctuated, it should nevertheless be viewed as an essential fuel for the movement's final assaults on the government which brought the war to a halt. In our first two sources, we were educated of the strain that the counterculture produced between the hawks and the doves of the anti-war movement. The hawks, who accounted for those looking to integrate the counterculture to a far greater degree, were more marginalised even in 1968, the time of our second source, and therefore only fueled the movement inasmuch as it contributed to the discourse within groups. On top of that, it could be argued that the counterculture was actually more of a hindrance at this point, as its aspects were pounced upon by those looking to compromise the movement, such as the media and police. Ultimately though, it was a critical force in compounding the ideas of the anti-war movement and profiting on the modifications in public opinion that emerged at the time of the third source. Therefore, though it did not consistently feature in the anti-war movement strategies, the counterculture offered a crucial element for it to achieve its ultimate goal in ending the war. For this reason, the counterculture was an essential fuel for the anti-war movement.